Continue. Good evening, everyone. At the beginning of this week's Parsha of Matot, we have the basic idea that kol hayotze mipiv yaseh, that what a person says can be translated into behavior, into action. It has, so to speak, an actuality to it that words alone would not have. And based on this idea that kol hayotze mipiv yaseh, we have the concept of nedorim and of shvuot, that a person can make a commitment that will prohibit things to him or commit him to do or not to do things, and that this commitment is made verbally by words that he says, even though in no way does he really impinge upon the object that he's talking about. So that communicates to us immediately this idea of the sanctity of words and of the power of words, and what it means, kol hayotze mipiv yaseh, that what a person says he is committed to do. However, in terms of halacha, there are requirements. Kol hayotze mipiv yaseh is a general statement. So we would all like people who uphold their words, who make promises, who give commitments orally. But many times we have that the words are insufficient, at least in terms of legal liability. So then we need kinyanim. We need actual acts that signify transfer of goods, commitment to do something. All of that is necessary because words alone are not sufficient. So there is a balance here, as always in the Torah, between the power of words and the fact that words alone many times are not effective in really creating legal liability. So we have a concept in Halacha, the Gemara quotes it, of something that's called a Mishapora. A Mishapora is Reuven committed himself to Shimon, I'm going to sell you my automobile. And they made no kinyonim between them. They didn't shake hands on it or anything. He just said, I'm going to sell you my automobile. And Shimon said, good, I'm going to buy your automobile. The next day, Shimon comes to Reuven. He says, all right, I'm ready to pay. Give me the keys. He said, I don't want to sell you the automobile. Or he says, Yehuda came and made a better offer. Or my wife doesn't want to sell the car. For whatever reason, he doesn't even have to have a good reason. So in halacha, Reuven is not bound to transfer the automobile to Shimon. There was no kinyan. It was just words. So we have this great concept of kol hayotze mipiv yaseh, that if you say something, you should live up to it. but it's not actionable, so to speak, in legal terms. Nevertheless, the Gemara says there's a moral obligation. And the moral obligation translates itself into a custom that was called in the time of the Talmud Misha Pora. It existed throughout the Jewish world. The Misha Pora is that by the Kriyas HaTorah, Shimon would get up and interrupt the Kriya and say, Misha Pora, whoever paid our forefathers for their commitments and punished those who did not live up to their commitments should take action against Reuven, who made a commitment to me and he has not fulfilled it. And this was declared publicly. Now, it had no legal effect. Reuven did not have to deliver the automobile. But it certainly had a social effect. And most people would prefer to go through life without ever having a Misha Pora advanced against them. Later on in Eastern Europe, the custom was that if a person felt that he was wronged by someone else, he could hold up the laning. He could be ma'akiv del kriyas HaTorah until the other person said, okay, I'm going to din Torah, we're going to pick the judges, and I agree. So these were social methods of enforcing what legally was not enforceable. Legally, the person doesn't have to sell the car, doesn't have to deliver the car. But morally, he does, because of this concept of kol hayotze mipiv yaseh. And therefore, these were mechanisms that Jewish society used in order to try to implement the moral message when they did not have the means to implement the legal message, the law itself. Now, we have different categories of commitments here that the Torah says. So it says, Ishki Ida Neder, someone that he takes a vow. Or Yishova Shvua, or he swears, he takes an oath. So obviously it's two different categories. Otherwise the Torah would not describe it in this way. And we find in the Talmud that it's two different Masechtas that exist. One is Masechet Nedorim, which deals with the laws of the Neder, and one is Masechet Shavuos, which deals with the laws regarding an oath. Now, Shavuos also has to do with Korbanot, because Shua is Gorein, causes a korban, etc. I remember there was a so-called rabbi that wasn't much of a rabbi, and before the holiday of Shavuos, he announced that he's going to give a lecture on Gemara Shavuos. And he didn't realize that Shavuos didn't talk about Shavuos, but it talked about the laws of making an oath, of taking a Shavuot. So the Gemara, in its own way, gives a general classification as the difference between a neder and a shvua. And this general classification, later in Jewish life, became the basis of great scholarship attributed to Rabbi Chaim Soloveitchik, that expanded, and in our time it's almost de rigueur in the yeshivas to speak in these terms. But it begins with the Gemara. The Gemara says a neder is an isur chefza. What the Gemara means by that is, if a person makes a neder, he's not going to enjoy fruit. So the fruit is osur to him. There's an isur on the fruit. There's no isur on the person. It's like the person ate non-kosher fruit, if we can give an example of that. So his words create a chefza of isur. And that's within the person's ability to do so. A person can make anything he wants osur upon himself or herself by saying a lashon of neder. A shvua does not. A shvua is that the person says, "I swear that I will not eat fruit." The fruit is not osur. That's an isur gavra. That's an isur on the person. The person has said he will not eat fruit. And so that falls into a different category completely. And this idea of hefza and gavra exists throughout the Talmud. And it applies, there are certain mitzvahs that the hefza of the mitzvah is itself the item, and there are certain mitzvahs where the item is not the mitzvah, it's my doing it, my wearing it, that becomes the mitzvah. And there are hundreds and hundreds of such examples. And as I mentioned, that this has become a common way in the yeshiva world today, that look at certain areas of the Talmud and decide whether we're talking about an isur gavra or an isur hefza. Now, there are different halachas. So there's a lot of technicality. Kol hayotze mipiv yaseh is a general statement. But if a person wishes to make a neder, so the Gemara in the Dorim says there are certain ways to do it. And if you don't do it in that way, the neder is not activated. It needs a certain language. And the same thing is true of a shvua. There are technicalities involved that it doesn't become a shvua just because somebody says, I swear. So it's a very complicated and complex Indian, for which I have told you, the Talmud devotes 2 tractates to it. But the general idea is the one that we understand and that we appreciate. So we'll see later in the week, we'll talk about the fact how you can cancel an neder. Can you cancel a shvua? What is the whole concept of canceling? How does that work? But that's for a different afternoon. Rabbi Chananya ben Akash Omer Rotza Goriv Baruch Hu L'Zakas Yisrael V'ficha Chibur Lahem Torah Mitzvot Shenemar Adonai Chafetz Man Tzidko Yagil Farad Yadir. Amen.